Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Were you prepared for this pandemic? In February, when the Standard & Poor's was at an all-time new high, were you ready for a world-disrupting and economy-disrupting pandemic? Speaking for myself, I didn't know there was going to be a little piece of RNA that would kill hundreds of thousands of people and shut down economies around the world. But I didn't have to know that specifically. I just needed to know that at some point, there was going to be another black swan. So most swans are white, but occasionally, and quite unpredictably, a black swan is born. It's completely random. So in economic terms, we use the term black swan to apply to completely random, unexpected economic disasters. And maybe disasters is the wrong word to use. They're not always disasters, but it sure feels like a disaster when they happen. And we can agree that none of us wants the word financial and disaster anywhere near each other. But how do we prepare for something when we don't know what it is or when it will happen? That's what this session is about. Humans have lived through a lot of black swan events, and we're going to look at a few of them today. And then we'll talk about how to prepare for them. First, the pandemic. We haven't lived through it yet. It's still active. Consider how tiny these viruses are. Our human DNA is a long string. You've seen pictures of it, but there are just 4 organic molecules in there. They're paired up 2 by 2 in a spiraling double helix, like a twisting ladder. And our DNA is made up of 3 billion of those pairs. They determine how we look, how we think, our health, everything about us that makes us unique as we grow from a fertilized egg to an adult. If our DNA was the size of a sewing machine thread, it would be 150 miles long. The coronavirus is made of RNA and is built of 4 molecules too. 3 of them are the same as DNA, and 1 is different. RNA is usually a single strand, but not in the case of the coronavirus. It too is a double strand. But compared to 3 billion pairs in our DNA, there are only 23,000 in a coronavirus. It's hard to imagine that something so small can be so damaging. Now think back to the first quarter this year. We got the news that the coronavirus was there. And then very quickly, Italy was shutting down. Iran was shutting down. China locked down part of their country. But we still didn't. And in many ways, we still don't have any idea of what the full impact will be. Look at what it did to the market. We had a high in February, and just 5 weeks later, we reached a low. Some thought there would be a recovery in 8 weeks, but it didn't work out that way. When the FDIC was passed into law during the Great Depression of the 1930s, it was supposed to eliminate all bank panics. And that made sense. Since it had always been individuals that caused bank panics, FDIC was passed to protect individuals. Then there should be no more bank panics, right? In fact, economists called the period of time from 1937 to 2007 the golden period because for 70 years, there was no bank panic. And many economists also predicted that there would never again be a Great Depression or Great Recession. How wrong they were, right? Let's consider a few more black swans. There have been many in history. We know there will be more. We just don't know what they will be and when they will happen. But when they do occur, they can cause great damage to our economy. It is hard to be prepared. Nobody wants to take the time preparing for something that may not ever happen. Think of this. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor of California, they spent millions and millions of dollars to create a surplus of emergency medical supplies, mobile hospitals that could be deployed anywhere in the state. When they did it, they were thinking of earthquakes. But the next governor dismantled the program completely because they needed to cut money from the state budget. No earthquake had happened to make them need them, so they felt like it was a waste of money. Boy, would they come in handy now. But again, preparing is hard. We're human. We don't like change. Do you remember Harry Truman? Not the President Harry Truman, but Harry Randall Truman. He lived at the south end of Spirit Lake, on the north side of Mount St. Helens. He owned and operated a lodge there for several decades. When geologists told him he should leave because it was probably in the eruption path of Mount St. Helens, he said no. He didn't want to abandon what he had built. Then, on May 10th, 1980, Mount St. Helens' north face collapsed right over Harry and his lodge. He's an extreme example, but he illustrates the problem for all of us. We're creatures of habit, and we don't want to change. So how do we prepare for the next black swan? Let's go back to 1815. I know most of you know your history, so you're probably thinking, yes, 1815, Napoleon lost at Waterloo. The Congress of Vienna decided to redraw the borders for an even distribution of power. Otto von Bismarck was born. It was a busy year. But do you remember Mount Tambora? Tambora was a volcano on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. It blew in 1815. And not only did it blow in a spectacular fashion. It threw molten rocks and molten lava 25 miles into the stratosphere. Think about that. Planes today fly at roughly 40,000 feet. That's about 7.5 miles. It was the most powerful eruption in over 500 years. Ash spread over thousands of miles. Here's how it compares with Mount St. Helens. With Tambora, ash and molten rock blew into the stratosphere, along with sulfur dioxide. It changed the weather. It created what was called the year without summer. Halfway around the world, in New England, in April, clothes were freezing on clotheslines. Tambora also created multiple tsunamis. It caused glaciers to surge down the Alps. Thousands died of starvation and typhus. In 1816, the following year, rainfall dropped by 4%, and it was 4 degrees cooler for over a year. Then there was Toba. 75,000 years ago, the eruption of Toba in Indonesia caused a population bottleneck. That means it nearly ended the human race. Toba was 40 times bigger than Tambora, 1,600 times bigger than Mount St. Helens. It caused a volcanic winter of almost 10 years. World temperatures dropped by nearly 10 degrees. Imagine what we know about Tambora and multiply it by 40. Imagine the tsunamis and their effect on coastal cities in the US. And if you're thinking it couldn't happen in America, well, think Yellowstone. It was a bigger eruption than Toba. And recently, there have been 70 earthquakes in Yellowstone, causing alarms for geologists and probably you and I. Black swan events can wreak havoc with agriculture, our electrical system, and of course, our economy. Maybe we'll never have another one. Or maybe, well, probably we will. It might be an earthquake or a meteor or a terrorist nuclear bomb in a major city. We can't predict the future. We can only look back to see black swans happen, and they happen on their own timeline. All we can do is prepare. As I said, we're in the middle of a black swan event now. We don't know how long it will last or what effect it will ultimately have on the economy. But since we're talking about economic effects, we should also talk about inflation. It is not usually considered to be a black swan, but maybe it should be. In the 1960s and 1970s, with inflation, the dollar lost 70% of its value. The dollar was worth 70% less, and it never recovered. Most people associate the high inflation of the 1970s with the oil crisis, but it was well underway a decade earlier. Look at the graph. Inflation is a slow destruction of the dollar. It's not a sharp bankruptcy of the country. For a rule of thumb, inflation is driven 2/3 by wage increases and 1/3 by commodity price increases. For the past few years, we've seen the slow but almost steady rise of inflation. I believe that in the middle of this current coronavirus black swan, that may have slowed the rise temporarily, but very likely we will soon be on that path again. But I also believe we have a number of years to prepare. We don't have to know exactly what will happen, but we can prepare. There are 4 ways to prepare for inflation and black swans, and I'm going to take you through them. We'll start with the worst 2 plans, then make our way forward for what I believe is the best way to prepare. Number 1 is to do nothing, or do the same thing approach. To use asset allocation, assuming that different asset classes will compensate for one another. When one is down, another one is up. When one is up, the other one is down. That was the idea going into the Great Recession. You could mitigate the damage. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. It was basically Harry Truman on Mount St. Helens, because most asset classes died at the same time. Bonds were down, stocks were down, commodities, real estate, all down. And it took about 7 years to recover. A volcano or a pandemic could take much longer to recover. Number 2, I was at a conference where there was an investment firm that had built a system using options to essentially guarantee little or no loss. You can add that into a stock portfolio and hedge it with put options. When stocks went down, the put options will go up. But even during a plunging market, you were protected from the downside. Now there's a cost to it, and that cost was about 6% a year. That's what you paid for the option puts. It's a better strategy than doing nothing if there is no inflation, but it only protects the stocks, not the bonds or commodities. And it's going to be the worst of the options if and when we hit high inflation. Number three is where you build a margin of safety. And maybe I'm biased in thinking this is better than the first 2, but that's because this is what I've done for my clients. It's what we did prior to the pandemic, and it's what we'll continue to do. This is the graph of what happened since 2009. When you look at the numbers and look at the forward projection, this seems to make more sense. For the first 2 quarters of 2020, my average client account was up over 15% from the end of last year. At the same time, the Standard & Poor's 500 had not yet completely recovered. And I don't believe it was just lucky. The 4th option, in my opinion, is the best option for building a margin of safety, but it's only been available to financial advisors for a short period of time. It's a long short, and I don't have enough time to talk about it in detail, but I have another presentation tomorrow where I will do that. Basically, you have both stocks that you expect to rise and stocks that are expected to fall. And you want to make money on both sides. So you want to make money in up markets, make money in down markets, you want to make money in flat markets, and you want to preserve capital and reduce risk. All that time, you're building a margin of safety so that when you do experience the next black swan, you're better prepared for it. It is your best option to help you get through something unforeseen. And if there are no black swans or no inflation, then you get superior results with minimizing risk. And that's the best outcome of all. It's all about the math. When you work the numbers, the first option of continuing to do the same asset allocation approach is going to be the worst, and the option hedging to prevent a downside is a little better in some cases, but not much. You can see from my track record how the 3rd option has worked so far through this pandemic. The 4th option, the long short, is relatively new, but my experience makes me feel it's the best approach. In reality, there's only one way I know of to validate an approach, and that's with an actual track record. And this is the actual track record of all my growth stock client accounts. It includes some conservative, mostly moderate, and a very few aggressive accounts. It's not a model. It's not back tested. It's the actual composite, net of all fees and cost. But in saying that, I also have to say past performance is no guarantee of future performance. That sentence doesn't inspire confidence for any of us. Think if an athlete had to say that before every race, or if two lovers had to say it before making love. Legally, I am required to say it, but all I have to offer is my track record, and of course, always followed by the disclaimer that past performance is no guarantee of future results. I'd be happy to talk to you about it in more detail and can take some questions now. Thank you.